Thank you again for joining us for this Free to Exist policy and research webinar. My name is Ian Down. I'm the policy and research lead at LGBTIQ+ Health Australia, and my pronouns are he, him. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the countries throughout Australia, their diversities, histories, and knowledge of their continuing connections to land and community, and to pay our respects to all First Nations people and to elders past and present. And feel free to use the chat function to share the lands from which you're joining today. Before we begin, I'd just like to mention a few housekeeping items. Our webinar today is being recorded and will be made available on the LHA website. If you miss any information, you will be able to find it there and go back and listen. So after the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and I invite you to use the Q&A function, which for most of you is located down at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, please feel free to ask questions at any time, and we'll come back to them after the presentations. And if anything in today's webinar raises concerns for you, support is available. You can contact QLife, which provides Australia-wide anonymous support for the LGBTIQ+ community. QLife services are free and include both telephone and web chat support. Call 1-800-184-527 or visit qlife.org.au. All right, so today's webinar, we're going to explore participation rates, experiences, and barriers faced by LGBTIQ+ young settings. And we're going to hear some recommendations for policymakers, sports managers, and physical activity providers on how to foster inclusive, welcoming, and safe environments for LGBTIQA+ youth. Our presenter is Dr. Ryan Storr, a research fellow in the Sport Innovation Research Group at Swinburne University. He's a multidisciplinary researcher, and his research interests focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion across sport and movement settings. His work is industry-focused and often collaborates with key stakeholders across the sports sector to devise solutions-focused applied research. He is also co-founder of Proud to Play, the peak organisation for LGBTIQA+ sport and active recreation in Victoria. So as I mentioned, Dr. Storr will answer questions after his presentation, so please do post any questions you may have using the Q&A function. And I'll hand over now to Dr. Storr. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'd just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm dialing in from Naarm in Melbourne, so pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also pay my respects to elders past and present. So I'm going to speak today for about 25 minutes on a recent project that I led, and then I'll have an opportunity to ask questions. Because of the function, normally I'll answer questions as we go, but just pop them in and then we can address them at the end. So my name's Ryan. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based at Swinburne University on a part-time research role. And then the other time I have my own consulting business, but previously I co-founded and set up Proud to Play. So I've got a lot of academic experience, but I've also got a lot of experience actually working with communities and sports out on the ground, especially at the community level. So this project was funded by Vic Health, which is a health promotion organisation here in Victoria, and was part of the Vic Health Research Impact Award, which was given to researchers to use research to help drive social impact and change. This was a missing piece of the puzzle for myself, but for many policymakers, government organisations, because ultimately one of the key pieces of information we were lacking was we did not know how many LGBTIQA+ people engage in sport and physical activity. We have it compared to the other demographic groups, but we don't have any anywhere in Australia that actually documents this. And at that time, we also wanted to do a kind of check around current levels of discrimination. So I've done a couple in certain sports over the last 5 years, but the last major one into discrimination rates was about 10 years ago. So just a bit of background around that. So 2014 was kind of a key year, which really started and launched a lot of the research into sport and physical activity. So one of my colleagues, Caroline Simons, did a big study through Beyond Blue around the impact of homophobic bullying in particular in PE settings and youth sport. And then we also had the Out in the Fields report, which was a big study done internationally, but a large base here in Australia around discrimination for LGBTIQA plus people in sport. And then we had 2014 kind of off the back of that Pride in Sport launch through ACON. And then 2016 here in Victoria, Proud to Play launched. 2017-18, I did two big pieces of research around discrimination in cricket and soccer or football here in Victoria. And then 2020, when I worked at Western Sydney Uni, did a pilot study to this particular research looking at young people in particular. We partnered with 2010 on that. And then 2024, so 10 years after kind of everything kicked off ultimately around, especially from an academic perspective here in Australia, we had the Free to Exist report. One thing I will caveat with some of the things that have happened in the movement in the space, there's been a lot of pledges and a lot of commitments and promises, but ultimately they've never been followed up with. And there's little evidence to show that many of the sports in particular have actually kind of followed up. So when the Pride in Sport Award launched 10 years ago, many of the kind of founding members of that made a commitment to end homophobia. Some of those sports have done very little in that and actively kind of engaging as much in this space now. We had another one a couple of years ago when some of the here in Victoria made a pledge with Pride Cup. But often we don't see much follow-up around that. So a lot of the sports will talk about doing work, but there's actually not as much happening in terms of that behavior lens and actual behavior change and work happening. So 2024 is a good time. It's really 10 years after the first major piece, so it's good to reflect on the kind of progress. So we did a mixed method study. So we actually did adults as well, but for the focus of this particular project and with Vic Health, we're just using 16 to 25 in terms of that age bracket. So all of this data specifically relates to that. So we did a large survey. There was over 1,000 people in that. And then the youth element was 504 or 505, I think. So that sample of 500 for those young people. So we'll talk about that. And we also did focus groups as well. With young people, we did about 5 or 6 focus groups with people who do currently play and those who might not actively engage in any sport and movement. So one thing I'll start with, so I've kind of just done a high-level summary because obviously there's a full report, there's some infographics, so please engage and use that as necessary, especially for up-to-date statistics and data around this particular space. But intersectionality was very prevalent. So in terms of the sample that we had, look, there was a large percentage of men in particular and boys identifying as straight or heterosexual. And this was a really interesting finding because look, the whole survey you can't do by accident in the respect of if let's say, straight identifying male did it by accident. There were so many questions about sexuality, homophobia, transphobia, all those type of things. You can't really do it by accident. We checked for duplicates, bots. People often, there's challenges around health surveys. Ultimately, sometimes right-wing groups might flood surveys to try and kind of affect the data and things like that. But we checked all the IP addresses and things like that. So one thing that really stood out for us is that young men in particular are identifying as straight or heterosexual. There's a whole range of reasons for that, but ultimately they might not have come to terms with it. They might just see it as sexual activity. So they might not, in terms of the men who have sex with men, umbrella, there might be from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds where, look, LGBT as a concept has been critiqued for being quite Western and ultimately within certain cultural groups and within the concept of gender and sexuality, that might not be the best term, but ultimately they see or identify themselves as this. And we also cross-check the data as well. And there are some slight differences, but it's not extreme in the response that all the straight heterosexual men didn't experience homophobia or didn't witness it and things like that. So I think that's a really important one, especially for sports and health promoters to understand that, especially amongst young men, they are probably less likely to identify as gay and share that information as well. And when you think about it, that 16 to 25 is a key kind of critical time for adolescent development and sexual attraction, those type of things. So they might be working through some of those. The other things that 42% of the sample were culturally and linguistically diverse, which is very large in terms of that sample. 16% identified as having a disability and 36% identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. We know from Vic government data that there tends to be a larger percentage of people who identify as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander who are LGBT. So that kind of actually complements some of the Victorian data that we see around that. So intersectionality it's an academic concept, but it ultimately means the idea that multiple forms of oppression intersect and impact on an individual. I think there's a key misconception amongst the sector now because they think intersectionality is just when people have different multiple identities. So they might be a person of color and have a diverse sexuality or gender, those type of things. But what they're kind of not addressing is the fact that it's the oppression that is affecting their experiences. So that's why we need to think about, if we are looking at intersectionality, then we look at anti-racism and anti-transphobia or anti-homophobia, those type of things. So I think a really important point is that, as we know, LGBTIQA plus communities are very diverse, but they're also very diverse amongst other compounding identities such as disability, First Nations, and culturally linguistically diverse. So that's why it's really important to kind of do all the aspects of diversity and inclusion, because then you're less likely to miss out those intersectional identities. So a very rich sample. We looked at sport and physical activity. Some of the insights here are probably more around sport, but one thing I'll say is that more LGBTIQA plus young people engage with physical activity, use leisure facilities and go to gyms than they do in sport, which I think is a really interesting finding, because ultimately the sports sector in years to come is in danger because they're going to lose participants to people in active recreation, going to the gym, leisure centres, swimming, walking, hike, all those type of things. So we know that it's kind of an active kind of cohort of people that kind of did the survey. So in particular, though, some of the kind of things that people do, so play social sport, active recreation was the largest one, muscle strengthening 34%, 33% play competitive sport. And interesting in terms of the findings, physical health or fitness was one of the key reasons, fun and enjoyment, and psychological mental health and therapy. So most people are engaging for a variety of reasons, but it's not necessarily around being the best and wanting to be an elite athlete. Competition actually drives a lot of people away, especially LGBTI communities. But ultimately, informal engagement is more dominant, and we're seeing more young people in particular choosing to engage in informal ways. And like, one of the problems around that, if there is a problem, is one of the good things about sport, and this research has shown it in the qualitative stuff, is that people like sport to be part of teams, to meet friends, to have social camaraderie, to have support networks, and they like that. And when they're excluded from that, they're not getting those benefits, especially around social capital and having support systems in place. So although it's good on the one hand that they can have that, they're being denied opportunities to engage in that structured kind of sport because they're being excluded or they're having negative experiences. So again, competitive sport in particular is in danger, and we're seeing signs that less young people are engaging in structured and competitive sport than previously. So 47% of the sample were registered to a sport team or club in the last 4 years. And obviously COVID had a part of that. But then it went down in the last 12 months when we asked people to report on it. So ultimately, takeaway message is that LGBTIQA plus young people participate in sport in particular around half the rate of their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. So Ozplay data shows it's around about kind of 62%. And what we found across the board that engaged currently was around just over 30%. So it's kind of about half. There is some US research which indicated similar. So it kind of shows you that it's consistent, but ultimately our communities in particular are participating around half the rate. So for sports organizations, that's really important because they all want more fans, more players, more spectators. And obviously all this information is in the full report, so I might gloss over some of it, but it's all there in all the stats and information. An interesting one as well is that around discrimination. So 10 years ago, Out in the Field showed that around 75 to 80% of LGBT people have witnessed or experienced discrimination, in particular homophobia. So comparing this now in the 10 years, overall across the board, 53% of respondents had witnessed homophobia and 40% had experienced homophobia or biphobia, transphobia, discrimination based on their identity. So that shows about a 25% drop in 10 years, which is a good sign. I would argue that there's been a lot more work happening. There's more organizations doing work in this space. We're seeing a lot more pride games, people are having conversations. We had marriage equality, things like that. So that shows a good kind of decline. However, when a young LGBTIQA plus person still has a 50-50 chance of engaging in sport and going down to a sport club or a movement setting and experiencing or witnessing discrimination, it's still too high. So there's still a long way to go, but it has come down. However, most worryingly, when we slice and dice the data in terms of the different letters of the alphabet, gay men still witness homophobia at 76%. So in 10 years, there's been no difference for gay men in sport environments in particular. And like when we think of the current climate, whereby just this last week, we had a fourth incident in AFL, when a player was banned and fined for using homophobic slurs. I don't think there's been an increase. It's always been there. It's just we're starting to hear more about it now in that regard. So some of the, sorry, I forgot that because my face was covering the green box, but in each slide, and these can be available afterwards as well, we kind of got some of the policy implications. So although positive progress is evident, we need targeted anti-discrimination policies in order to address this problem, because ultimately homophobia in male sport environments is not going away. And it's having significant impacts on not just LGBT people, but often homophobia is used as a tool against straight people. Interviews I've done over the years is even if you have a haircut that looks different, people might get accused of being gay. So previous research I've done actually shows that around 50% of samples, broader samples, have experienced or witnessed homophobia. So it's actually used quite regularly against heterosexual people. So it's not just a problem that is affecting LGBTIQA plus people. So some of the policy implications of that: policies need to be updated with practical and evidence-based solutions, and understanding that we need specific anti-discrimination policies. So one thing that I've kind of seen is that because there's been such a push towards inclusion in the last couple of years, and that sports now are trying to be more inclusive and taking steps to inclusion, to include LGBT people, one of the things that they've not addressed is the discrimination and anti-homophobia in particular, and transphobia. So I think in the pursuit of inclusion, we've actually forgot to address exclusion. So I think that's a key thing for sports organizations to really consider. Interestingly, with this one, the main takeaway is that for the young people we spoke to, their sense of belonging was low in sports clubs. So this idea and concept that if you're an LGBT person or whoever, regardless of your identity, the fact if you play sport, normally evidence suggests that you have an increased sense of belonging because you're part of a team or you're part of a club. when in fact we didn't get that evidence from this. So I would say an explanation of this is that in terms of those LGBTIQA plus young people who do play and participate in sport, only around 50% of that sample were out or told teammates or people around their identity. So it's a large percentage of people who are playing sport and are not out or telling people. I think because of that, they're not getting a sense of belonging because they don't feel that they can truly be themselves. So they can be themselves, tell people, not have to worry about how their teammates or coaches might respond. And then with that, they would feel that they belong in that club and that team. Whereas because they don't have that or they don't perceive it as safe, then we're not getting that belonging. So I think it's a really interesting thing for sports to consider, in that they often say that sport produces belonging, increases social value, all those type of things. For LGBT people, actually doesn't do that often, and it excludes them. Another interesting thing that came up was young people's attitudes towards pride efforts. So we kind of asked a few questions around this, but it was quite organic in the focus groups around the conversation and how it went. And although a lot of young people spoke about the positive things of having like pride games, for example, they did often speak about the fact that it was quite transparent when sports organizations were not putting in any effort, were not engaging with LGBTIQ plus communities, and were trying to kind of do performative efforts to look like they were doing something. And ultimately the young people saw straight through them. I remember one particular young person said that their sport had done some work and they'd done a big pride game and things like that. But then after that, it stopped. And they kind of said, oh, well, if you'd have spoken to my sport, I think they've fixed and solved homophobia and there's no problems. And they literally did nothing after that. And the young people kind of saying that it's not just a one solution thing where you do it once a year, like it needs to be a sustained effort. And I think some of the young people were kind of really cognizant of that. So I think one thing, which is a good thing, is that all sports organizations need to do is properly engage young people in their decision making and their efforts to be inclusive for LGBTIQA plus people, and they will absolutely have them covered. Their ideas were fantastic. They knew what sports needed to do. I think sports organizations and movement providers just now actually need to listen and engage and give young people a platform to be able to help solve these problems, trial solutions, hear feedback, and those type of things. So the attitudes towards pride efforts were quite strong in that regard, because often if they didn't always necessarily get it right or like mediate social media, often the young people spoke about having to come off social media because of the narratives and discussions. So let's just say, as an example, when the Manly jersey thing happened in Sydney and there was people refusing to wear the jersey and stuff, there was lots of online social discussions, those type of things. And young people see those conversations in the comments. It's hard to kind of get away from them, especially on whether it's TikTok, Instagram, news items and things like that. And that kind of caused stress. So when young people see negativity online, it negatively impacts their mental health. That was quite clear from the qualitative data. One person said I had to turn myself off, like offline. I started seeing that stuff because it was just, I guess, triggering a part of me. But I would say I do think there's importance of Pride Round. So I think it's mainly, especially around the execution of Pride rounds and Pride games in particular, and how to kind of safeguard and think about commentary around that. Interestingly, around things that encourage participation as well, some of the young people spoke about. So in terms of what we asked questions in the survey in particular around what would help facilitate participation for young people in sport and physical activity. And interestingly, friend referral or support was the top one. Welcoming and affirming culture of LGBT people was 44. Second, LGBT specific common tribe programs, 41%. Anti-homophobia biphobia, transphobia initiatives or policies 36, inclusive policies. And interestingly about the policies, people spoke about the absolute need for them, especially around trans inclusion policies. But a lot of the young people said it doesn't really matter because they don't get enacted. They're literally there. Nobody reads them. Nobody enacts them or looks at the policy. So they were kind of saying, look, policies are great, but only if they're actually used, because otherwise there's no point having them if they're not going to be engaged with. Accessible and inclusive facilities, Pride game match or celebration, 32%, and cost of funding assistance. So again, that Pride game celebration is an interesting one because people were saying, yes, it's absolutely needed, but again, around participation, there wasn't much evidence to show that having Pride games would encourage people to play it. It might be better or more appropriate for people to go to games and maybe watch AFL game, cricket games, netball, all those type of things. But it was really interesting one. So I think sports organizations need to really think about how they engage with Pride efforts and Pride games, how they go about it, and what type of impact they're wanting to have. Because I think if it's from that trying to address anti-discrimination, it might not be the most appropriate tool for certain people. And I think ultimately people are kind of looking to it to solve all the problems when it's one part of a larger piece that kind of needs to be engaged with. So in terms of some of the kind of key summary takeaway points, participation rates are roughly LGBTIQA plus young people are participating in sport and physical activity around half the rate of the wider population compared to Ausplay data. More young people are engaging with active recreation, leisure facilities, those type of things. Interestingly, I kind of forgot to mention, but young people are still experiencing problems and discrimination in those settings. Maybe not as prevalent, but there are still definitely problems and concerns, whether it's the gym floor, the kind of male bro kind of cultures around that, those type of things, or classes, changing facilities and swimming pools, those type of things. So there are kind of issues, but we know that more of our young people are engaging with that than sport. And look, if they want to do that, that's excellent. But I think the issue for me is they should have the opportunity to do the sport as well. And it needs to be equitable, it needs to be safe, it needs to be open for them as a human right. If they don't want to engage with it, that's fine. But I think another thing that stood out from the sample is that young people do want to play sport socially, but they would like to play with their friends, to have fun, to get those social connections, to meet people and to feel part of something. Because I think one of the kind of challenges for trans and gender diverse young people in particular is peer rejection. So especially around young people, if we can really encourage trans and gender diverse young people to engage in sport when it's safe, it actually can really have a positive impact for them, because having that peer support and acceptance is known to positively improve their mental health and well-being. So it's very much around young people need to have the opportunity to do that. And it's a difficult one as well, in the respect that sport participation in particular, 80% is youth under 18. So often sports organizations say we don't have any LGBTIQA plus young people. They probably do, but they either don't know about it. We know that they're not sharing that information, but also they might not have affirmed their identity yet. They might, as a gay man, they might not do it until they're 25, or they might not affirm their gender identity till later. But the fact is, if they're operating in environments which are discriminatory and not supportive and not affirming, then they're sending a message, and it's creating this kind of toxic culture that we need to kind of address afterwards. So it's kind of really important that we get these environments right so they're not doing any harm. The vilification and discrimination is still a concern. So although there has been improvements, and I would say there has been a lot more targeted kind of efforts in the last 10 years. So I would suggest that those efforts in particular have had a positive impact, but there's still a long way to go. And some sports are doing better than others. So this was like across the sample, but obviously different people in different sports. And there are some sports which had a higher percentage of people, of LGBT people than others. So that's all in the report as well. for example, I think basketball and badminton were some of the top sports for participation. Most of the sample was here in Victoria because it was funded by Vic Health, but yeah, there are some great kind of clubs doing it. And interestingly, there are LGBT specific clubs, whether it's like the Melbourne Chargers or the Sydney Convicts, which are the gay rugby clubs. But most of the participation, that 16 to 25 category, was mainstream sports clubs because they're not really at that age yet where they're going in. And most of the sports clubs are for kind of older, especially older gay men. But yeah, so that's why mainstream sports clubs in particular in these movement kind of spaces need to really ensure that they're being completely inclusive of LGBTIQA plus young people. That is my kind of main summary findings. Obviously, there's that main report, but I can't see the questions, so I might let you answer any questions. So if there's any follow-up ones, and you can just ask me, and then I will answer, no problem at all.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That was really interesting. And yes, we do have a couple of questions. And there's also a question just for clarification on some of the data that you mentioned at the beginning. You mentioned that the younger men were more likely to identify as straight or heterosexual. I think it was around 40%. And just wondering if you were able to get a sense of, were those cisgendered men, or could there potentially have been trans men within that group?
Yeah, no, sorry, we did check obviously because trans people can absolutely be heterosexual. No, it was cisgender men because there was a kind of a smaller sample of trans and gender diverse people. I actually did supported colleagues, Ada Chung from Melbourne Uni, who've done something similar, but specifically just around trans and gender diverse people in sport and physical activity. So that will be coming out soon. But in this particular project, we didn't have a very large sample of trans and gender diverse people. And ultimately, I think that's because it's such an obviously awful environment for those communities currently that it's keeping people away and they're not engaging. So when people are kind of discussing, trans people will bring down women's sport and those type of things, well, they're not engaging in sport because of those messages. So I think it's really important for sports organizations to actually understand that they're not participating. They do, but not anywhere near what people are kind of suggesting. So yeah, mostly those young heterosexual men were cisgender, and I didn't get to speak to any in the focus groups, but ultimately we had some really interesting discussions because originally it was like, well, do we include them in the sample, and whether we just have people who self-identify as LGBT. But we know from speaking with some First Nations communities, they as well would be likely to maybe identify as heterosexual. Again, culturally diverse people and those concepts of diversity might not resonate. And we know in Canada, for example, the two-spirited people, they identify as heterosexual as well. I had a colleague go to a conference and watch some presentations on that. So I think that's an interesting area as well. And it ultimately, I think, speaks to men who have sex with men, and from a sexual health policy, how we reach those communities, whether it's HIV messaging, monkeypox, but we're seeing it here because ultimately, again, they self-selected and completed to do the survey. So ultimately, it's not up to us to police around that. But I think it's important for us as kind of researchers and people working in the space to understand that the diversity of people and how people identify really is quite broad.
All right, so we've got quite a few questions actually. So there's a question around differences between different sports and also different types of sports. So, for example, swimming, diving, gymnastics, were there any differences observed there? And also thinking about styles of sport, was there something around team sports and more particularly invasion style games? Did you notice any differences?
Yeah, so look, we didn't do a complete whole analysis comparing them. We can do that down the track, but one thing I will say is that in the report there are a breakdown of like the top sports and things, but we have to have some caution. So for example, I I think two of the biggest sports were, especially in the older sample of adults, were basketball, because here in Victoria, there's an organization called Queer Sporting Alliance, which is a large LGBT club. So I think a lot of people at that club did the survey, which obviously suggested that everyone's playing basketball, but in the grand scheme of things, it's probably still quite small. Badminton was there, and the Melbourne Chargers, I think they had a large uptick of people who did the survey, which was great. But again, it kind of looks like everyone's playing rugby when in the grand scheme of things, I don't think everyone is playing rugby in that regard. But we do have, yeah, some comparisons. Team sports, there are, in terms of the young people in the sample, was quite strong. So I think AFL, soccer, a couple of other ones, netball, they were well participated in. But what we see across the board generally, and from the work I do in Proud to Play, we tend to see a lot more people now in queer communities going towards what we would call fringe sports. So, for example, indoor rock climbing. There's a big club down here, Climbing Cuties. Ultimate frisbee. We're seeing a lot more people engage in those sports. And some of the feedback I've had and around research is because they're kind of smaller and newer sports, well, not newer, but yeah, they see it as less likely to have experiences in discrimination. Whereas if they're playing cricket, soccer, those bigger ones, they're more likely to engage or to see or witness experience discrimination. So yeah, we're seeing that a lot more now around people being attracted to kind of those smaller sports or in maybe clubs or leagues. Because I know Queer Sporting Alliance now has netball, basketball, and roller derby and things like that as well. So roller derby was well represented as well, especially amongst trans and gender diverse people, because they have some very good policies and practices within those sports. So yeah, but generally, previous research as well shows that a lot more gay men will go and participate in the gym and individual sports like tennis, yoga, those type of things. Whereas more women and lesbian in particular are more likely to participate in kind of team-based sports.
All right, and there's a question around LGBTIQA plus specific clubs and whether the participation rates are different. And I think you alluded to that in your talk. You said that older gay men were more likely.
Yeah, so look, generally across the board, what we find is that the queer sports clubs, historically, because I think men have been excluded more to a degree, whereas lesbian in particular have always been part of the sports structures and have helped, especially AFLW, for example, have helped build up those structures and those clubs. So generally, cisgender lesbian women in particular and sexuality diverse women have participated in community sport, in mainstream sport, but gay men have more gravitated towards specific individual and team sports, LGBT specific. And look, we see that in terms of experiencing still high discrimination rates for gay men in particular. So I think that is, yeah, an explanation around that. But interestingly, within the youth sample, we did analyze and check, and I think nearly 95% of the young people were not participating in those queer sports clubs because they're, yeah, more older. We haven't yet crunched all the data from the adults because they were well represented. But again, yeah, it was more the adults who were playing in queer sports. And I think a lot of sports clubs just haven't really marketed and geared and attracted towards that youth cohort. So I think, especially from that 18 plus, there could be a lot more work done to try and engage.
Thank you. And just a question on so people who have experienced transphobia in a sporting club, apart from the club and association support and the police, how can these spaces be made safer?
Look, I think with around transphobia in particular, I think the kind of anti-trans movement has been very successful in infiltrating sports spaces in particular and kind of giving certain messages and confusing people around safety and men versus women and those type of things. So what we're seeing is sports organizations are being a bit dumbfounded in how to respond and how to address some of these challenges, concerns, those type of things. Especially around, like saving women's sport and all those type of messages. So ultimately what we're seeing is the sports just don't know how to handle it and they don't know how to respond. As an example, in Sydney, there has been issues, especially in the media, around the Flying Bats inclusive women's cricket football club, soccer, because they're trans inclusive and they've got a couple of trans players in their team and they've been playing people for years. But they've really latched onto it and they've started sending abusive emails and messages and those type of things to all the staff at Football Australia now. And ultimately, they just don't know how to respond to it. So I think there needs to be a lot more work going on. And I think we need to really rely upon the legal frameworks around the Sex Discrimination Act, the Equality Act here in Victoria, and kind of use that more. Because in terms of some of the issues, transphobia in particular is by far the worst that we're kind of seeing. And I think, and there are stories though as well of positive news. So for example, we interviewed and did a case study of Melbourne University Football Club, and they told some stories about, like, because they're trans inclusive and they have trans players, coaches and stuff. And there were some really great stories there around how to create these spaces for them. So there is good work out there. And we do know that sport can be a positive experience for some trans and gender diverse individuals. So we kind of need to be looking to them more and to share information and to kind of say, actually, it's not that scary. These are some of the basic things that you could do, whether it's updating registration forms, websites, those type of things. So although there are negative things happening, there is actually some really good practice, but we don't often hear about it. So I think it's important to highlight some of the good work that is happening.
Well, actually, that brings us to what's probably going to be our last question. Speaking about the sort of practice that occurs to make safer places, what about in schools? Are you aware of any sort of best practice programs that help make the teams more inclusive? Because apparently teachers are reaching out to try and find, get some advice on how they can do this in their schools.
Yeah, so a really interesting thing that I didn't mention here. So thank you for bringing that up. So ultimately, in terms of the qualitative stuff, especially, we found that schools are still the most problematic and challenging place. So discrimination is still very high, still very enforcing a gender binary, and ultimately there's very little. So one of the key findings in the report is that discrimination in schools is still really problematic, and there doesn't seem to be a lot happening. I think the safe schools kind of incident really stopped any work happening, and trying to access young people through schools was quite challenging. And I think the legacy of that we still see because especially in the pilot study we did with 2010, we heard all sorts of stories about young people in PE, but even from PE teachers who are actually engaging in the discriminatory practices. So PE is a really interesting one, and that's an area that I will be advocating for that needs work because there isn't much happening. And from the work that we're doing or have done in Proud to Play, it's been very hard to engage in school sport and things like that. So there are some good practices that are happening around specific teachers taking it upon themselves to do things, whether it's, for example, running races, and instead of having the boys and the girls and things like that, just having different stages. And if you want to run fast, you go in the first group. Or if you want to run with your friends in a slower pace, you go in the second group. So there are lots of things like that kind of happening. But I think that's a key one, because ultimately what we saw in the research is that young people are having negative experiences in school, and it's switching them off from sport and physical activity, often sometimes for life. And then especially the work that we're doing kind of Proud to Play, often it's kind of re-engaging people who've been traumatized by engaging in this when they were younger and trying to re-engage them. So we really need to kind of hit the nail in the respect of targeting youth environments, because if we know that young people have positive experiences, they're more likely to then engage as adults. And the other research that it found is that there's a large drop-off from young people to adults. So people stop playing sport, and that's one of the reasons, because of schools.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's a really interesting session. And yeah, I guess I'm proud to play would be a source of some resources to
Yep.
people.
So we have a website and there's a resource and education page. So we've got some free things that people can download, like a checklist. There's some education free online thing that we did with Play by the Rules. So yeah, there's plenty of information there. But if anybody else has any questions, please add me on LinkedIn, email me. More than happy to answer any questions. But yeah, I would encourage people to download the report as well. So it's on the Vic Health website, or if you need me, I can send you the link as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Ryan. Okay, so just a reminder that there is support available at QLife. So call 1-800-184-527 or visit qlife.org.au. And I'd just like to again thank Ryan and thank you to the participants who came along. And yeah, just wish you a good afternoon and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.